Our second scripture reading today comes from Matthew 26, verses 14 to 16. Then one of the 12, who was called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What will you give me if I betray him to you?" They paid him 30 pieces of silver, and from that moment he began to look for an opportunity to betray him. This is the word of the Lord. So to begin this morning, I'd like to take you back to May 17th, 1966. I was not alive at that point, but I'd like to take you back to that time. And I want to... Maybe you hear me better if I turn this on. Is that a little bit better? There we go. All right. May 17th, 1966. We're all on the same page? Okay. I want to tell you a story about one of the most pivotal moments in rock and roll history. Some of you might know what I'm talking about. We're going to go back to Manchester, England, where Bob Dylan was playing a concert at the Free Trade Hall. Now, during the first set of his concert, Dylan played the songs for which he had become famous. He played songs like "It's All Over Now, Baby Blue," "Just Like a Woman," and "Mr. Tambourine Man." And during that first set, every song that he played was a solo that he used an acoustic guitar. But then during the second set, he left and he comes back and he has this band with him called the Hawks. And he starts playing all his music using an electric guitar. Dylan had begun experimenting with electric instruments in 1965, and he had started to distance himself a little bit from his folk roots. Now the audience who was there to watch him play, they loved his folk music. But they weren't so happy about him playing with an electric guitar. In fact, they began to turn on him during that second set. They believed that by playing rock music, he was betraying the very people who had made him famous. Now, as this second set wore on, the crowd became more and more agitated with Dylan. After every song, the crowd would sit in silence and then clap slowly and defiantly to show them how much they disagreed with what he was doing. And then, right before the last song of the second set, as the band was getting prepared to play "Like a Rolling Stone," a man in the audience named Keith Butler yelled a single word at Dylan. "Judas" is what he called him. Now Dylan, who was indignant at the insult, replied to him, "I don't believe you. You're a liar." Now this moment, it was spoken about throughout the entire world of music because this moment was so critical, because it was the moment that rock was transformed into an entirely new era of music. Dylan used this moment to transform rock into a more artful form of musical expression. Now, what I want to focus on is the insult that Keith Butler uses to describe Dylan. Judas. Why does he call him Judas? Well, I think many of you are aware that Judas is the character in the New Testament who was responsible for betraying Jesus. Judas was one of Jesus' inner circle, one of the people who Jesus relied upon to spread his ministry. But then, at a certain point, somewhere along the way, Judas became frustrated with Jesus, turned his back on him, and was willing to sell him out for 30 pieces of silver. Now, that term, selling out, you all have heard it before? Yes? Okay, it comes from this story. And it means that you have invested your life in a particular cause, and then you're willing to turn your back on that cause for money. Now, Dylan, at this concert, when he started playing rock music, everybody in that audience believed that he was playing rock because he wanted to make money. They believed that he was willing to abandon his folk roots to become wealthy. And so that name, Judas, it's synonymous with rejecting your beliefs and turning your back on your ideals. And this morning, I want to talk about the historical roots of this kind of betrayal and why it is so closely associated with Jesus of Nazareth. We all on the same page? We know where we're going this morning? Okay, so to begin, I want to talk a little bit about the sermon series that we're going to be doing during Advent. Now, you heard Adrian get up here and talk about Advent, but let me just lay it out for anybody who may not know what Advent is. So, Advent is a season in the Christian calendar. Now, our normal year for generally everybody around the world begins what day? January? Right, 1st. In the Christian calendar, that's not when it begins. It actually begins during Advent because that's the time where we prepare for Jesus' birth. And during Advent, we're going to stop our sermon series on the Gospel of Mark, and we're going to do a sermon series called Jesus As. And I think it's really important that as we anticipate Jesus being born on December 25th, that we contemplate how Jesus represents the culmination of so many different characters from the Old Testament. Now, last week you heard Adrian get up here, and she talked about Jesus as, does anybody remember Jesus as? Moses. Okay, so Jesus is Moses, and basically what she talked about was Moses, he gives the law to the Israelites on Mount Sinai, and Jesus, he gives the law to Christians during the Sermon on the Mount. And the basic message that she came away with that morning was both Moses and Jesus, they help us follow God's will. So today, we're talking about Jesus as Joseph. Now, if you were here during my sermon series last year where we were talking about Genesis, I actually made this comparison then. And so I just want to give you really briefly a little insight into what I said at that time. What I said is that both Jesus and Joseph, they suffer so that people can be saved. So in Joseph's story, what happens is he ends up being sold into slavery by his brothers, and then he ends up rising to power in Egypt so that he can store up grain during the years of plenty, allowing the Egyptians and his family not to die during the years of famine. So he suffers for a time so that other people can be saved. Jesus, similarly, he ends up going to Jerusalem and being crucified on the cross. So he suffers for a time so that humanity can be saved. Now, that's not what we're focusing on today so much, but I just wanted to put that out there so you know about it. You can go watch that sermon online if you really want to know what I'm talking about, and you don't know what I'm talking about. Today, we are looking at another similarity. And this similarity is between when Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers and Jesus being sold out to the authorities by Judas. Now, in order to understand the comparison between these two, I need to get into some of the details of Joseph's story, because if you don't understand the details, the similarities aren't going to make sense. So, Joseph, he is one of 12 brothers. That number 12 is very, very important in the Bible. It comes up over and over again, and every time you see it, it's referring to the 12 brothers or the 12 sons of Jacob. These 12 men, they become the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. So let's recap. You got Jacob. What's his other name in the Bible? Do you all know? Israel. Okay, so you have Jacob. His name is also Israel. He has 12 sons. Those 12 sons become the father of the 12 tribes. This is important because when the Israelites escaped from Egypt, Adrian referenced how there's a movie about to come out about that, right? And you know, Christian Bale, he's playing Moses because that's what Moses looked like, right? Was Christian Bale. He's a good-looking guy. When he's coming out of Egypt, they settle in the Holy Land, and the way they divide up the Holy Land, they carve it up according to those 12 tribes. So anytime you see that number 12, what it's referring to is the beginnings of the nation of Israel. You follow me? We're on the same page on that one. Now, how many disciples does Jesus have? Do you all know? 12. This is not a coincidence. The gospel authors want you to be thinking of the beginnings of Israel, because in the same way that Jesus begins his new movement with 12 disciples, they want you to think of how God began the old movement with the 12 brothers. Now, whether or not Jesus actually had 12 disciples, that's actually a matter of scholarly debate. And we're actually going to get into that in our sermon series on Mark when we return to it. But for now, let's assume he had 12 disciples, because this is going to make things a lot easier for this particular sermon. So we have 12 brothers, 12 disciples. We on the same page? Okay. Let's go back to Joseph's story for a minute. Now, in Joseph's story, his brothers are angry at him because he is the most cherished of all of their father's sons. Jacob, he just lavishes gifts on Joseph. And it's clear that he favors him over everyone else. Now, it's important for you to understand that the brothers, they don't actually like this very much, but they're willing to put up with it, right? But what pushes them over the edge is when Joseph, he has a series of dreams where he makes it very clear that one day he is going to be ruling over his brothers and his father. That is the proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back, and they're like, you know what? We got to get rid of this guy. We're done with him. So that's when they conspire to kill him. One day, Joseph, he's walking out into a field, and the brothers, they're like, all right, this is our chance. We can take care of him now. But right before he gets there, Reuben, one of Joseph's brothers, and the name of a very tasty sandwich, I might add, he convinces his brothers not to kill him. So they end up throwing him in a pit, and they're sitting there having lunch, actually, which I think is funny, while he's in this pit. And these Ishmaelite traders, they come by, and Judah, another one of Joseph's brothers, says, hey, let's sell him to these Ishmaelite traders. And so they do so, and they end up receiving 20 pieces of silver in return. Now, Judah sells Joseph into slavery for 20 pieces of silver. In the New Testament, the man who is responsible for selling Jesus to the authorities, his name is Judas. Now, the Old Testament was written in what language? Hebrew. The New Testament was written in what language? Greek. We have two different languages. Interestingly, if you take the Hebrew name Judah and you translate it into Greek, it comes out as Judas. Again, the authors want you to be making a comparison between the circumstances that lead to Joseph's suffering and the circumstances that lead to Jesus' suffering. So the next question we have to ask is, what were those circumstances? Well, I think everybody in here knows why Judah sells Joseph into slavery. Joseph, he makes a prediction about the future that Judah doesn't particularly like. And so he's like, you know what? I'm going to get rid of my brother. But why does Judas sell out Jesus? That's a much more challenging question. Because in the New Testament, if you read closely, all they tell you is that Judas was evil and greedy. But that's not really the reason why. If you look in Mark, for instance, right before Judas sells Jesus out to the authorities, Jesus actually makes a prediction about the future. He talks about the temple being taken to the ground, which is something we talked about a few weeks ago. And he discusses how those people who follow Jesus, these people are going to undergo a great deal of suffering. And apparently for Judas, he doesn't really like this very much. And so this sets into motion the events that result in Jesus' death. Now, for me, the motif, the theme that starts to emerge from all this is that betrayal occurs when two people disagree about where the future is going. And I think this is a truism in our lives. Have you ever noticed how when a leader talks about the future, that tends to be when people turn against that leader? Abraham Lincoln, he talked about a future where slaves were free to pursue their own lives. And what happened to him? He was killed. Martin Luther King Jr., he talked about a future where we lived in a society free of racial prejudice. And what happened to him? He was killed. Why does predicting the future result in betrayal? Because if the future you see and the future I see are two very different things, then I want to ensure that the future that you see does not come about by eliminating the person who predicted it. In Joseph's story, he predicts a future where he's going to rule over his brothers. And so, what does Judah do? He wants to get rid of the possibility of that future, so he gets rid of his brother. In the same way, Jesus, he predicts a future where his followers are going to suffer. And Judas, he doesn't want to suffer. So what does he do? He gets rid of Jesus. And the irony of this is that in all of these instances, whether it's Joseph, Jesus, whether it's Abraham Lincoln or Martin Luther King Jr., the very act of trying to extinguish the future by eliminating the person who predicted it is the very thing that makes that future possible. In every single instance, when you eliminate the person who predicted it, it brings it about. And this brings me back to Bob Dylan on May 17th, 1966. Now that evening, when Butler calls Dylan Judas, what I find to be so striking about that particular event is that it has some similarities to when Jesus is on trial. Jesus, he's on trial, right? And they're trying to get him crucified, and these people who were so for him originally have turned against him, right? And Dylan, he's giving this concert, and these people who were with him during the first set, what happens during the second set? They turn against him because they do not want to hear about the vision that Dylan has for the future of rock. And so when Keith Butler calls Dylan Judas, what I find to be so striking about that is that actually he's referring to himself, because Butler is the one who is unwilling to hear what Dylan has to say about the future of rock. And what happens that night when Dylan is crucified by that crowd for doing something that they didn't like? Well, what happens? It opens the door to this entirely new era of music. By fighting the future, it's what makes it possible. You see, I think that when we are fearful of what the future holds, that is when we are in danger of becoming like Judas. And let's be honest, most of us are afraid of what the future holds. It doesn't matter what stage of life you are in, the future represents uncertainty, and uncertainty raises our anxiety. It doesn't matter whether you're in elementary school, in elementary school and you're going into middle school. You know what? That's a really scary experience. If you're in high school, transitioning to college can be a very stressful time. Whether it's a new job, a new relationship, moving to a new location, a new child, a new illness, a new death in the family, life never seems to give us a break from the unknown. And our instinct in situations where the future seems uncertain is to hold on to what we know. We will fight to keep what we have and declare anyone who stands in our way to be an enemy. But I believe that the moment that you feel life should remain as it is, that it should not change, that the future should be a mirror image of the present, that is the moment when you allow your fear of the unknown to rule your life. I can tell you that for myself, the moments of greatest uncertainty in my life have been where I have grown the most in my faith. You all know from listening to me preach for the last year and a half, I'm a very rational, logical person. Faith is not something that comes very easily to me at all. And I tend to sympathize with Judas. I'm a lot like him. When the future feels uncertain, I want to control things. I want to make sure the situation turns out the way I want it to turn out. And I'll even do that to the point where, like Judas, I'll hurt people to get my way. But what I've realized is that in those instances where I'm trying to control things, that the world has a way of working around my desire for control. And so what I have come to embrace is this notion that I really have no control over the future. I let go of that, and I have to trust that God is going to place me where I'm supposed to be. Now, when I say that, you have to trust God to place you where you're supposed to be, I don't mean to intend that that means everything is going to work out great for you. There are lots of people who trust God who have horrible things happen to them in their lives. It makes me so angry when I hear a pastor get up and sit there and say, you know what, if you just trust God, everything's going to be okay. That is patently untrue. The disciples, Jesus' disciples, they all trusted God. And what happened to them? Every single one of them met a horrible end. That said, I really do believe that if you trust God, you're going to see more clearly where you're supposed to be. So, Joseph, he was supposed to be in Egypt to store up grain. Jesus, he was supposed to be in Jerusalem so that he could be crucified. Abraham Lincoln, he was supposed to be president so that he could free the slaves. Martin Luther King Jr., he was supposed to be a pastor so he could lead the civil rights movement. And you have something important that you are supposed to do in this world. Maybe it's being a listening ear to a stranger. Maybe it's being a good parent to your children. Maybe it's playing beautiful music for those who are downtrodden. Maybe it's giving words of hope to those who are hopeless. Maybe it's showing forgiveness to those who have wronged you. Whatever it is, God has a role for you. And if you are willing to embrace the uncertainty of life and not run from it, then I guarantee you're going to do some amazing things in this world. Some things that are very, very important. And so as I end today, may you have the strength to embrace the uncertainty of life. May you have the ability to let go of a future over which you have no control. But most importantly, may God give you the faith to believe and trust that God is going to place you where you're supposed to be. All of us have a role to play. The question is, are you going to fight the future, or are you going to help to make it better? Amen.